For months, the Nancy Guthrie investigation followed a familiar pattern: large search operations, public appeals, FBI coordination, press conferences, investigators promising they were still pursuing every possible lead. But recently, something changed. Quietly, without dramatic announcements, without major headlines, and people following the case immediately noticed it. Search operations slowed down. Public communication shifted. The language investigators used became more careful, more controlled. And then came reports suggesting federal authorities had quietly changed direction behind the scenes. That single possibility transformed the entire case, because when investigators suddenly reduce visible search activity in a high-profile missing person investigation, it usually means one of two things: they are losing leads, or they are focusing intensely on something specific they do not want public attention interfering with. That distinction matters enormously, especially in a case already filled with unanswered questions, conflicting timelines, and growing national attention. The Nancy Guthrie investigation has become one of the most heavily watched missing person cases in America, not only because of the disappearance itself, because of how strange the case became afterward. The timeline, the phone data, the shifting focus of investigators, the growing FBI presence, and now, the quiet changes happening behind the scenes. To understand why people are paying such close attention to those changes, you have to go back to the beginning. Nancy Guthrie disappeared under circumstances investigators immediately considered suspicious. There was no clear sign she intended to leave voluntarily, no confirmed explanation that fully made sense publicly. And from the start, investigators appeared to believe something serious had happened. The search response reflected that immediately. Large coordinated operations, air support, ground teams, federal resources, public alerts. Everything about the early investigation suggested urgency, and urgency in missing person cases tells the public something important. Investigators fear time is critical. That fear intensified as details surrounding the timeline became increasingly difficult to explain, particularly the narrow windows of missing time investigators repeatedly referenced. One detail especially captured public attention: a specific gap in the timeline during the early morning hours. People online became obsessed with it. What happened during that missing stretch of time? Who was with Nancy? Why did investigators focus so heavily on that period? And why did the case suddenly appear to shift direction afterward? Those questions only grew louder as investigators became more selective with public information. At first, authorities released updates frequently: search locations, appeals for tips, requests for surveillance footage. But over time, something changed. The updates became shorter, less specific, more cautious. That shift did not go unnoticed, especially online. People following the case began comparing earlier press conferences with more recent statements. The difference was obvious. Investigators no longer sounded like they were searching broadly. They sounded like people narrowing focus privately. That distinction changed public perception dramatically. Because broad searches suggest uncertainty, narrow focus suggests developing theory. And once the public believes investigators have developed a private theory, every action gets analyzed differently, especially reduced search activity. Recently, reports emerged suggesting parts of the large-scale search operation had been scaled back significantly. Again, that can mean many things: resource limitations, lack of actionable leads, or investigators quietly transitioning from a rescue-focused operation into something else entirely. A criminal investigation centered on specific individuals or locations. Authorities have not publicly confirmed such a transition in direct terms. But people following the case believe the tone of the investigation has undeniably changed. And perhaps the strongest sign came from the FBI involvement itself. Federal agencies do not typically maintain heavy presence in missing person investigations indefinitely without strategic reason, especially not quietly. If federal coordination continues while public search visibility decreases, many investigators interpret that as a sign the investigation may have become more intelligence-focused than search-focused. That possibility terrified people following the case, because it suggests authorities may believe the answers are no longer hidden in open wilderness searches or public tip lines. They may believe the answers exist within a smaller circle. Specific people, specific movements, specific digital evidence. That theory gained momentum after reports connected investigators to renewed analysis of phone data, surveillance timelines, and behavioral patterns surrounding individuals close to the case. Again, officials have not publicly confirmed every detail, but the direction of the investigation appears increasingly different from where it began. And that difference matters, because early missing person investigations focus on finding someone. Later investigations often focus on proving what happened. Those are not the same thing. One is rescue. The other is reconstruction. People watching the Nancy Guthrie case now believe investigators may quietly be moving from one phase into the other. And if that belief is correct, then the entire meaning of recent investigative changes becomes far darker, especially because authorities continue emphasizing one critical point publicly. They still want information. That detail matters enormously, because investigators usually stop broad public appeals only when they believe random public tips are no longer the primary path toward answers. Instead, they begin concentrating on inconsistencies, digital timelines, interviews, behavioral analysis, the invisible details ordinary people cannot see from outside the investigation. That possibility exploded online after several commentators suggested investigators may now be testing competing theories internally, not publicly, privately. And once people began believing that, every quiet move by investigators suddenly felt significant. Every reduced search operation, every carefully worded statement, every refusal to answer direct questions, all of it started looking less like uncertainty and more like strategy. The deeper people looked into the investigation, the more unusual the timing of the changes began to feel, because investigators did not suddenly scale back activity at random. The shift appeared to happen after several key developments behind the scenes. Developments authorities have still not fully explained publicly. That silence became one of the biggest reasons the case exploded online. Because modern audiences notice patterns quickly, especially in high-profile investigations, and many people following the Nancy Guthrie case believe investigators stopped behaving like people searching blindly. They started behaving like people protecting a developing theory. That difference is enormous. At the beginning of the case, authorities seemed focused on possibility. Possibility she was lost. Possibility she was injured somewhere. Possibility someone in the public had seen something important. That is why the early search operation was massive. Ground teams, drone units, air support, federal coordination, door-to-door efforts. Everything about it suggested investigators believed immediate discovery remained possible. But recent weeks changed that feeling completely. Public search visibility dropped. Investigators became more selective. And perhaps most importantly, they stopped revealing as much. That is often one of the clearest indicators an investigation may be moving into a more sensitive phase. Because public transparency helps during broad searches. But secrecy becomes more valuable once investigators begin narrowing attention toward specific possibilities. Former federal investigators watching the case noticed the shift immediately. Several experts publicly commented that the FBI's continued involvement, despite reduced public search activity, may indicate investigators are prioritizing evidence analysis over physical search expansion. That interpretation spread rapidly online, because it suggested something terrifying. Investigators may believe the critical evidence already exists. They may simply be trying to prove what it means. That possibility changes how every detail gets interpreted, especially the timeline. The Nancy Guthrie timeline has become one of the most analyzed parts of the entire case. Specific windows of missing time, phone activity, movement patterns, reported sightings. Every minute now feels important, because investigators themselves repeatedly reference timing during public updates. That naturally caused people to focus obsessively on narrow stretches of unexplained activity. One particular period became central online. The early morning gap people continue discussing repeatedly. What happened during that time? Why does it appear so important? And why have investigators never fully explained what they believe occurred there? Those questions continue driving enormous public attention, especially because authorities appear unwilling to dismiss the significance of that timeline publicly. And when investigators refuse to minimize something, people assume it matters. That assumption intensified after reports surfaced, suggesting investigators were re-examining digital evidence connected to the case: phone records, location data, communication timelines, surveillance review. Modern investigations increasingly depend on digital reconstruction, not eyewitness memory. Phones create invisible timelines people often do not realize exist. Movement, stops, connections, gaps. Investigators can reconstruct astonishing amounts of behavior through digital evidence alone. That is why many people believe the Nancy Guthrie investigation quietly became far more technical than the public initially realized. Not a wilderness search anymore, a reconstruction, a digital map of final movements. That possibility terrified people following the case. Because digital investigations usually move differently than public searches. They are quieter, more focused, more secretive. And that description now fits the Nancy Guthrie investigation perfectly. Another major reason people believe the case changed direction involves the language investigators began using publicly. Words matter enormously in investigations, especially federal investigations. Early statements focused heavily on locating Nancy safely. More recent statements sound different, more procedural, more careful, less emotional. That tonal shift stood out immediately, especially to people familiar with how missing person investigations evolve over time. One retired investigator explained it this way: when authorities stop speaking emotionally and start speaking strategically, it usually means the investigation has narrowed. That statement spread widely online, because many people already sensed exactly that. The investigation feels narrower now, more targeted, even if authorities refuse to publicly confirm what they are targeting. That uncertainty created another explosion of speculation. Some believe investigators are focusing intensely on one individual privately. Others think digital evidence may have contradicted earlier assumptions completely. Some even believe federal agencies may be withholding information deliberately to monitor behavior from people connected to the case. Again, there is no public confirmation of those theories, but they continue spreading because the investigation itself now feels unusually controlled. And controlled investigations create suspicion automatically, especially in America's current media environment. People no longer assume silence means nothing. They assume silence means strategy. That psychological shift affects everything. Every reduced search operation now appears intentional. Every vague public statement feels calculated. Every unanswered question becomes larger. And perhaps no question has become larger than this one. Why did investigators quietly change direction? Because people following the case increasingly believe they did. Not publicly, operationally, behind the scenes. That belief intensified after reports suggested authorities may now be concentrating more heavily on forensic analysis than broad physical searches. Forensic timelines, digital behavior, interview inconsistencies, behavioral reconstruction. That transition matters because it reflects a fundamental change in investigative thinking. A search operation asks, "Where is she?" A forensic investigation asks, "What happened to her?" Those are very different questions, and many people now believe investigators may quietly be prioritizing the second one. If true, that would explain almost everything: the reduced visibility, the tighter communication, the FBI's continued involvement, the increasingly strategic tone. Because once investigators believe the answer exists within evidence already collected, the case changes completely. As investigators became more guarded publicly, another disturbing detail began attracting attention. The people closest to the case appeared to be under increasing scrutiny, not publicly accused, not officially named as suspects, but carefully analyzed. That distinction matters enormously, because federal investigators often avoid revealing where investigative pressure is actually focused, especially if they believe someone connected to a case may still be talking, communicating, or unknowingly revealing useful information. That possibility changed how people interpreted nearly every new development, especially the sudden reduction in visible search activity. At first, many assumed scaling back searches meant investigators were running out of leads, but others argued the opposite. They believed investigators may have stopped searching publicly because they no longer expected the public to solve the case. Instead, they may now believe the answers exist within a controlled group of evidence already collected. Phone records, interviews, location data, behavioral inconsistencies. That theory gained enormous momentum online after reports surfaced suggesting investigators were quietly revisiting earlier statements and timelines connected to the case, not looking for new random tips, re-examining existing evidence. That distinction is critical, because re-investigating existing evidence usually means investigators believe something important may have been missed the first time, or misunderstood. Modern investigations increasingly depend on exactly that process: digital reconstruction. Phones alone can reveal astonishing detail: movement patterns, stops, speed, connections between devices, periods of silence. Investigators can sometimes determine not only where someone traveled, but when behavior suddenly became abnormal. And many people now believe the Nancy Guthrie investigation may revolve around exactly that kind of abnormal digital moment, a point where the timeline stopped making sense. That belief intensified after multiple commentators focused on the same troubling issue. Investigators continue treating specific time windows as critically important, even months into the case. That is unusual. Most missing person investigations broaden over time. This one appears to be narrowing. And narrowing investigations usually mean investigators believe the key events happened inside a very specific sequence. That sequence may already be mapped privately, just not publicly. One former federal analyst explained why authorities often avoid revealing timeline conclusions too early. Because once investigators publicly describe exactly what they believe happened, people connected to the case can adapt their stories around that narrative. Silence prevents adaptation. That explanation terrified people following the investigation, because it suggests authorities may intentionally be withholding major conclusions while quietly monitoring reactions behind the scenes. Again, there is no official confirmation that is happening here. But the behavior of investigators increasingly resembles that kind of controlled strategy, especially the FBI involvement. Federal agencies typically become deeply involved in missing person investigations for specific reasons: interstate movement, digital evidence complexity, potential criminal activity, behavioral analysis support. And once federal analysts begin reconstructing movements and communication patterns, investigations often become dramatically quieter publicly. Not because activity stops, because activity becomes invisible. The public sees fewer helicopters, fewer search crews, fewer press conferences, but behind the scenes investigators may actually be working more intensely than before. That possibility completely changed online perception of the case. Suddenly, reduced visibility no longer looked reassuring. It looked ominous, as if authorities had stopped searching publicly because they believed the investigation had entered a different stage entirely. One focused less on rescue and more on proving what happened. That fear deepened after reports suggested investigators may have become increasingly interested in inconsistencies surrounding movements, communication gaps, and behavioral changes connected to individuals close to the case. Again, authorities have not publicly identified those inconsistencies in detail, but behavioral analysis experts following the case noted something important. Investigators repeatedly avoided closing the door on criminal possibilities even while limiting public information. That combination matters, because if investigators truly believed the disappearance involved no criminal component, public messaging would likely look very different by now. Instead, the tone remains cautious, controlled, strategic, and deeply unresolved. Meanwhile, online communities following the case became increasingly obsessed with reconstructing the timeline independently. Maps appeared everywhere: phone ping theories, estimated travel windows, surveillance possibilities. People analyzed every public statement frame by frame, searching for hidden meaning. That level of obsession happens only when the public believes investigators know more than they are saying. And many people now believe exactly that, especially after recent reports suggested authorities quietly adjusted investigative priorities without fully explaining why. Some believe forensic evidence triggered the shift. Others think digital analysis changed the direction completely. Some suspect investigators may have uncovered contradictions privately during interviews. Whatever caused it, people following the case agree on one thing. The investigation no longer feels like it did at the beginning. It feels more focused now, more controlled, more careful, and perhaps more dangerous. Because controlled investigations often indicate investigators are trying to protect something extremely sensitive. A theory, a suspect, a sequence of events, or evidence they believe could eventually become central to prosecution. That possibility has become one of the darkest aspects of the entire case. Not because investigators publicly confirmed it, because their behavior increasingly suggests they may already be operating from a much more developed understanding of what happened than the public realizes. And if that's true, then the quiet changes happening behind the scenes may not mean the investigation is slowing down at all. It may mean investigators believe they are getting closer. If investigators truly are getting closer, then one possibility becomes extremely important. Someone may already know that. That is one of the reasons federal investigators often become quieter as cases evolve. Not because they have less information, because they may suddenly have too much information to reveal safely, especially if they believe certain individuals connected to the case are still watching public updates carefully. And in high-profile investigations, people absolutely watch. Families watch, journalists watch, potential witnesses watch. And sometimes, according to former investigators, the people investigators are most interested in watch even more closely than anyone else. That is why strategic silence matters. Because every public statement influences behavior. If investigators reveal too much too early, they risk contaminating interviews, altering timelines, or giving people opportunity to adjust explanations. That possibility may explain why the Nancy Guthrie investigation now feels so unusually controlled. Especially compared to the beginning. Early investigations are chaotic, urgent, broad. Later investigations become precise. And precision appears to be exactly where this case is moving. One detail especially intensified public concern recently. Investigators reportedly returned attention toward previously examined evidence rather than announcing major new search zones. That shift is significant, because it suggests authorities may believe the critical breakthrough will come from reinterpretation, not discovery. In modern investigations, that happens more often than people realize. Cases break open not because investigators suddenly find something new, but because existing evidence finally aligns differently. A phone record suddenly matters. A timeline contradiction becomes clearer. A movement pattern no longer fits earlier assumptions. And once one inconsistency collapses, entire narratives can collapse with it. Many people following the Nancy Guthrie case believe investigators may now be approaching exactly that kind of moment, especially because the FBI reportedly continues assisting behind the scenes despite reduced public search visibility. That detail keeps returning. Because federal involvement without heavy public search activity feels psychologically different. It feels analytical, quiet, deliberate. Like investigators are reconstructing something piece by piece rather than searching blindly anymore. That interpretation exploded online after several former law enforcement commentators suggested the investigation increasingly resembles a behavioral and forensic timeline case. That phrase matters, because behavioral cases focus intensely on contradiction. Who changed stories? Who behaved differently after key events? Who suddenly became inconsistent under pressure? Behavior often reveals things evidence alone cannot, and investigators are trained to notice even subtle shifts, especially in long investigations where timelines become deeply established. One investigator explained that once authorities narrow a timeline tightly enough, pressure begins increasing naturally around anyone whose statements do not fully align with reconstructed evidence. That pressure does not always happen publicly. Sometimes it happens quietly through repeated interviews, forensic review, digital analysis, and surveillance reconstruction. Again, authorities have not publicly confirmed specific investigative tactics in the Nancy Guthrie case, but the overall direction increasingly resembles that kind of focused approach, especially because broad public appeals now appear less frequent than before. That matters, because broad appeals usually indicate uncertainty, Focused silence often indicates developing confidence, and confidence inside an investigation changes everything, even without arrests, even without public announcements. People following the case began noticing another subtle detail too. Investigators increasingly avoided speculative public language. Earlier statements left open many possibilities. More recent statements sound narrower, more disciplined, almost as if authorities are trying very carefully not to reveal which theories they still consider viable privately. That restraint tells experienced investigators something important. The case may now involve evidentiary strategy, not just information gathering. And evidentiary strategy means investigators are thinking ahead, toward prosecution, toward legal standards, toward proving sequence, intent, movement, and behavior inside a courtroom eventually. That possibility terrified many people following the case online, because it implies investigators may no longer be asking, "What could have happened?" They may already be asking, "What can we prove happened?" Those are radically different investigative stages. The first seeks possibilities, the second tests evidence. And many believe the Nancy Guthrie investigation quietly crossed from one stage into the other recently, especially after reports that some investigative resources had been reallocated away from open-area search operations. That kind of shift rarely happens randomly. Search operations consume enormous manpower and cost. Investigators reduce them only when strategic priorities change. And strategic priorities change when investigators believe probability has changed. The probability she is alive. The probability evidence exists elsewhere. The probability specific theories deserve more attention than others. Authorities still publicly maintain hope and encourage tips. That is standard and important. But many people studying the investigation believe the operational behavior behind the scenes now tells a much darker story. One centered less on rescue and more on reconstruction. That perception intensified after online analysts began comparing the Nancy Guthrie case to other major investigations where authorities quietly transitioned from missing person operations into targeted criminal investigations before publicly acknowledging it. Historically, that transition often happens gradually. First, reduced search visibility, then tighter communication, then greater focus on digital evidence and known associates, then silence. A very strategic kind of silence. People following the Nancy Guthrie investigation increasingly believe they are watching exactly that process unfold in real time. And if they are right, then the quiet changes happening now may eventually become recognized as the moment the investigation truly turned dark. As the investigation became more controlled, another question started haunting people following the case. What exactly caused investigators to change direction so quietly? Because something clearly did. Large investigations do not suddenly narrow focus without reason, especially investigations involving federal coordination. Something altered the internal understanding of the case, and whatever that something was, authorities have still not fully explained it publicly. That silence became one of the most analyzed aspects of the entire investigation. Some believe digital evidence triggered the shift. Others think interviews changed everything. Some suspect investigators discovered inconsistencies that only became obvious once timelines were reconstructed minute by minute. Whatever happened, many observers now believe investigators stopped treating the case like a broad disappearance and started treating it like a contained sequence of events. That distinction matters enormously. Contained events usually involve limited variables, limited movement, limited opportunity, and limited people connected to the critical timeline. That possibility changed how the public interpreted nearly every statement authorities made afterward, especially statements about cooperation. Investigators repeatedly emphasized they continued speaking with people connected to the case. That wording matters. Because in complex investigations, repeated interviews are rarely random. Investigators revisit people when evidence changes, or when behavior changes, or when earlier statements no longer align perfectly with reconstructed timelines. Behavioral experts following the case pointed out something else that felt significant. Authorities never appeared eager to eliminate criminal possibilities publicly, even during quieter periods of the investigation. That restraint stood out, Because law enforcement often reassures the public aggressively when they believe no criminal activity occurred. Here the tone remained cautious, measured, almost intentionally unresolved. That unresolved tone created enormous psychological pressure around the case, especially online. Every new detail now feels amplified. Every delay feels meaningful. Every silence feels intentional. And perhaps the most important shift happened in how people viewed the FBI's role. At first, many assumed federal involvement primarily supported large-scale search coordination. But as public searches slowed while federal attention reportedly continued, interpretations changed completely. Now people increasingly believe the FBI's role may center around analysis, digital reconstruction, behavioral assessment, timeline verification. The invisible parts of investigations ordinary people never see. That interpretation intensified after multiple commentators pointed out how modern federal investigations increasingly depend on technology rather than visible field operations. Phone extractions, metadata analysis, location mapping, communication reconstruction, surveillance synchronization. Investigators can now rebuild astonishingly detailed movement patterns from digital evidence alone. And if the Nancy Guthrie investigation truly shifted toward that kind of analysis, it would explain almost every recent change. The reduced public visibility, the narrower communication, the strategic silence. Because digital investigations operate differently than physical searches, they are slower publicly, but often much more precise privately. One former federal investigator described it this way: once investigators believe the answer exists inside the data, the investigation becomes quieter, but more dangerous. That statement spread rapidly online, because many people already sensed exactly that feeling. The case no longer feels random. It feels narrowed, directed. Like investigators may already believe they understand far more than they are prepared to say publicly. That possibility became even more unsettling after reports suggested authorities may have revisited certain locations and evidence more than once without publicly revealing why. Repeated forensic attention usually means something important. Investigators rarely return repeatedly to the same material without strategic reason, especially in high-profile federal-supported cases. Again, authorities have not publicly confirmed what specific evidence may be driving the investigation now, but their behavior increasingly suggests confidence in certain areas and uncertainty in others, and that imbalance matters. Because investigations become quieter when authorities stop searching everywhere and start testing specific theories instead. That possibility changed the emotional tone surrounding the case dramatically. Early public attention focused on fear. Now it increasingly focuses on anticipation. People believe something is building behind the scenes, not publicly visible yet, but developing. One online analyst described the current phase perfectly. It feels like investigators stopped looking outward and started looking inward. That phrase captured exactly why the case now feels darker than before. Because outward investigations search for possibilities. Inward investigations search for accountability. And accountability-focused investigations operate differently. They become patient, strategic, methodical. Investigators stop reacting publicly and begin constructing privately. That construction may include timelines, digital evidence charts, behavioral comparisons, interview analysis, every contradiction examined carefully, every unexplained gap tested repeatedly. And once investigators begin operating at that level, public silence becomes more understandable. Because complex theories require protection until evidence reaches legal standards, especially if authorities believe someone connected to the case may still be unaware how much investigators actually know. That possibility now sits at the center of public fascination surrounding the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Not just what happened to Nancy, but what investigators may already know privately. Because many people no longer believe authorities are simply searching. They believe authorities are building something, carefully, quietly, and if they are right, then the most important phase of the investigation may already be happening behind closed doors right now. By now, many people following the Nancy Guthrie case believe the investigation is no longer moving randomly. They believe it is moving towards something specific, slowly, quietly, deliberately. And that belief comes from one overwhelming pattern. Investigators appear increasingly careful about what they say publicly. That caution matters, because experienced investigators understand something the public often forgets. The closer an investigation gets to a potential breakthrough, the more dangerous public information becomes. One wrong statement can compromise interviews. One leaked theory can alter behavior. One public assumption can destroy the value of future testimony. That is why strategic silence often increases near critical investigative moments, especially in cases involving federal coordination. People following the Nancy Guthrie investigation now point to several examples suggesting exactly that kind of shift may already be happening. Repeated emphasis on timelines, repeated references to digital evidence, continued federal presence despite reduced public searches, and perhaps most importantly, a growing sense that investigators are no longer asking broad public questions. They appear to be testing narrow private answers. That distinction changes everything, because narrow answer investigations usually mean authorities believe the key sequence of events already exists inside the evidence. They are simply trying to confirm it. And confirmation is one of the hardest parts of criminal investigations, not because investigators lack theories. Because theories must survive court, evidence must align perfectly, timelines must hold, digital records must support movement, witness statements must withstand scrutiny. Everything has to connect. That process takes time, especially in emotionally charged cases where public pressure is enormous. And public pressure surrounding Nancy Guthrie has become massive. People dissect every update instantly. Every word from investigators becomes headline material. Every search reduction creates panic online. That attention affects investigations in complicated ways. It helps keep focus alive. But it also creates enormous risk, because investigators now operate knowing millions of people are watching every move, including, potentially, people directly connected to the case itself. That possibility explains why some former federal analysts believe investigators may intentionally be allowing certain assumptions to circulate publicly, while protecting the actual direction privately. Again, there is no official confirmation of that strategy. But strategic ambiguity is common in major investigations, especially when investigators believe revealing too much could damage future prosecution. That possibility became even more believable after authorities reportedly continued analyzing communication patterns and movement reconstruction long after large-scale search operations slowed down. That detail matters enormously, because communication analysis is not rescue-focused work. It is evidentiary work. Investigators examine who contacted whom, when communication changed, when phones stopped moving normally, when routines broke. Human behavior creates patterns. And once patterns break suddenly, investigators pay attention, especially in disappearances involving unexplained timelines. One retired behavioral analyst explained that people often misunderstand modern investigations completely. They imagine dramatic breakthroughs, confessions, single pieces of evidence. But many cases today are solved through accumulation, tiny inconsistencies layered together until one narrative stops holding. That explanation feels increasingly relevant to the Nancy Guthrie case, because authorities appear deeply focused on sequence, not random speculation. Sequence. What happened first? What happened second? Who moved where? Who communicated when? And where the timeline no longer makes sense. That final part may be the most important, because many people now believe investigators identified moments in the timeline that fundamentally changed how they view the disappearance. Moments the public still does not fully understand. That belief intensified after online investigators noticed authorities repeatedly avoided discussing certain gaps in detail publicly. Instead, they referenced them carefully without fully explaining why they mattered. That is often intentional. Investigators protect sensitive timeline conclusions because they help identify truthful versus false statements later. Only the people truly connected to events know certain details. Protecting those details preserves investigative leverage, which means every unanswered question in the Nancy Guthrie case may serve a strategic purpose. Investigators are not prepared to reveal yet. That possibility transformed public perception completely. The investigation no longer feels stalled. It feels concealed. Like critical movement may be happening privately, while public visibility intentionally decreases. One journalist covering the case described the atmosphere perfectly. The investigation appears quieter now, but somehow more serious. That emotional contradiction is exactly why national fascination continues growing, because people instinctively understand something important. Cases do not become this controlled without reason, especially not cases involving continued FBI coordination. And the FBI presence continues looming over everything. Not loudly, quietly, which many observers find even more unsettling. Visible federal action feels understandable. Invisible federal activity feels ominous, especially in a case already filled with uncertainty, timeline gaps, and unresolved questions. Now, many people believe investigators may already possess a far clearer understanding of what happened than the public realizes. If that belief is correct, then the current silence surrounding the case may not represent lack of progress at all. It may represent preparation for something investigators are not ready to reveal publicly yet. And if that moment eventually comes, people may look back at this quiet phase as the point where the entire investigation secretly changed forever. In the end, the most unsettling part of the Nancy Guthrie investigation may not be what the public knows. It may be what investigators are intentionally refusing to say, because after months of searching, federal coordination, digital analysis, and timeline reconstruction, the case now feels fundamentally different than it did at the beginning. Not wider, narrower, more controlled, more focused. And many people believe that change happened quietly for a reason. Early in the investigation, the goal seemed obvious. Find Nancy, search everywhere, follow every possibility, hope she could still be located safely. But now, the emotional tone surrounding the case has shifted completely. People are no longer asking where investigators should search next. They are asking what investigators already discovered. That distinction changes everything, especially because authorities continue behaving like people protecting something strategically important, not publicly revealing it, protecting it. And investigators usually protect information for one major reason, because they believe it may eventually matter in court. That possibility has become impossible for many observers to ignore, especially after months of carefully controlled communication and increasingly targeted investigative behavior. One former federal prosecutor explained that investigators often become quieter once they believe a case may eventually require prosecution rather than public assistance. At that point, preserving evidence becomes more important than satisfying public curiosity. That explanation fits the Nancy Guthrie investigation disturbingly well, because public curiosity surrounding this case has become enormous, yet authorities continue revealing remarkably little. That imbalance tells experienced investigators something important. The most critical developments may now be happening privately, behind closed doors, inside interview rooms, inside forensic labs, inside digital reconstruction reports the public may never fully see. That reality frustrates people following the case intensely, because uncertainty is emotionally exhausting, especially prolonged uncertainty, and the Nancy Guthrie investigation has become defined by prolonged uncertainty. What happened during the missing timeline gaps? Why did investigators quietly reduce visible search operations? Why does the FBI reportedly remain involved so heavily? And perhaps most importantly, what caused authorities to quietly change direction? Those questions continue driving national fascination because no complete public answer exists yet. And until one does, every quiet move by investigators will continue attracting attention. Every statement, every silence, every visible change in strategy. People now analyze the investigation almost the way analysts study intelligence operations, searching for meaning in behavior itself. Because many believe the behavior of investigators now tells a story more significant than the words they are saying publicly. A story suggesting the case may have moved far beyond broad uncertainty, toward something more specific, more evidentiary, possibly more prosecutorial. Again, authorities have not publicly confirmed that interpretation, but the operational changes surrounding the case increasingly support it psychologically, and psychology matters in investigations. Not only the psychology of suspects or witnesses, the psychology of investigators themselves, how they speak, how they narrow focus, how they protect information. Those behaviors reveal things too, especially to experienced observers. One investigative journalist covering the case recently described the current atmosphere surrounding the investigation as the calm before revelation. That phrase spread rapidly online because it captured exactly how many people already feel. The case no longer feels chaotic, it feels contained, and contained investigations are often the most dangerous kind. Because by the time authorities narrow focus internally, they may already understand far more than the public realizes. At that stage, investigations become less about discovery and more about confirmation. Confirming timelines, confirming contradictions, confirming evidence strong enough to survive legal scrutiny. That process can take enormous time, especially in high-profile cases where every mistake becomes public instantly, which may explain why investigators continue moving so carefully now. Every decision matters. Every statement matters. Every detail matters. Because once authorities move publicly in a major case like this, there is no reversing it. That is why patience often becomes part of the strategy. Frustrating for the public, necessary for investigators. Meanwhile, the public continues waiting, watching, analyzing, trying to understand what changed behind the scenes. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of the entire investigation. The fact that almost everyone agrees something did change, not publicly announced, not officially explained, but visible. Visible in the silence, visible in the strategy, visible in the way the investigation quietly transformed from an urgent public search into something much darker, something more controlled, something that increasingly feels less like investigators searching for possibilities and more like investigators preparing for answers.